The Navy's Dolphins and Sea Lions. Start with the stakes. Mines don't announce themselves. They wait in murky water, anchored to nothing but a bad decision, and a ship pays the price. In narrow choke points, one diver with a limpet charge can stall a convoy or threaten a nuclear sub. That's the problem the U.S. Navy faced from the 1960s onward: low-visibility threats in high-value waters. Divers were slow, sonar was crude in cluttered harbors, and the margin for error was thin. If a living sensor could patrol continuously and find a mine before a ship did, lives would be saved. While that was happening in San Diego, engineers watched bottlenose dolphins do something machines couldn't: discriminate objects by sound with stunning precision. Echolocation, clicks that paint the underwater world, let dolphins see a mine casing hidden in silt, a shape tucked into pier pilings, a diver at night. Trainers learned to shape behaviors around that ability. The bet was simple: teach a dolphin to search a grid, mark what doesn't belong, and signal a handler. Not to blow it up, just to find it reliably and quickly. The Navy built routines. A boat would drop a dolphin at the edge of a search box. The animal swam a path, clicked, listened, clicked again. If it detected a target, it marked the spot with a buoy clipped from a harness or surfaced and touched a panel on the boat to indicate found. A separate disposal team handled explosives. The speed shocked people. In training tanks, dolphins outpaced divers by orders of magnitude. In open water, they still beat everything else the Navy had for short-range detection. Sea lions entered the picture for a different reason. They don't echolocate, but they're agile, have sharp eyes in low light, and can chase a human underwater without bubbles or motor noise. Handlers developed interdiction tasks: attach a clamp to a swimmer's leg or gear that tethered them to a surface buoy. Security teams could then reel in a suspect without lethal force. In ports that stored nuclear weapons or kept ballistic missile submarines, that mattered. Officially, these missions were non-lethal. The animal found or tagged. People handled the rest. The first operational heritage traces to Vietnam-era efforts. The Navy established a program near Point Loma, San Diego, and forward-deployed teams to evaluate port security and mine countermeasures in muddy, debris-filled environments. Reports from those years, later trickling out through declassifications and FOIA, describe animals identifying test mines faster than any human team and disrupting mock saboteurs during exercises. The work never fit the image of weaponized animals attacking targets. The core value was detection and marking. Here's a micro-story. A handler in a small rigid-hull boat held a shaker full of fish on his lap and tapped the edge of the console. The dolphin surfaced, bumped the panel with its rostrum, and rolled back under. Minutes later, a bright buoy bobbed up 30 yards away, tied by a thin line to something heavy on the bottom. The handler radioed the EOD team. The diver who swam down later said the mine would have fooled him. A tire and chain framed it perfectly against junk. The dolphin hadn't been fooled. Meanwhile, the bureaucracy adapted. The program built veterinary care, transport protocols, and deployment kits. Specialized pens followed ships. Aircraft carried animals in stretchers filled with water and foam. Trainers, many of whom formed deep bonds with their animals, learned to read stress, tune schedules, and argue for rest periods when operations demanded more than biology could give. Their journals told a different story than procurement memos. Individual temperaments, off days, a dolphin that loved a certain target shape and ignored another until retrained. Controversy shaped the narrative from outside. Activists accused the Navy of offensive use, teaching dolphins to deliver explosives or harm divers. The Navy denied it consistently, framing the mission as defensive: find, mark, and deter. Interviews and internal documents backed the detection-first story, though rumors lingered in part because the program was classified for years. Every leak created a vacuum filled by speculation. Trainers who spoke later described the hardest part as the public thinking their animals were weapons, not sentries. Then came real deployments. In the Persian Gulf, during mine clearance operations around the Iran-Iraq War's sprawl of hazards, and again in the early 2000s, Navy teams used dolphins to sweep approaches and anchorages. The animals marked suspect objects, divers verified and neutralized them. In those waters full of scrap and noise, the dolphins' discrimination mattered. Even with better sonar, the last 10 meters were tricky. A fast, trainable mammal could reduce false positives and speed the work. Sea lions saw work in harbor security at home. Their interdiction cuffs, spring-loaded rings with a line, were quietly tested alongside human patrols. The idea wasn't to make arrests underwater. It was to stop a swimmer's progress and flag their location without bullets or explosives in crowded ports. Whether these were used in anger remains murky. Officially, the program highlights demonstrations and exercises. Trainers, bound by non-disclosure agreements, hint at real-world events without details. The ambiguity fuels the ethical debate. If we can't see the record, how do we judge the practice? What nobody knew at the time outside small circles was how hard captivity ethics shaped daily choices. Dolphins and sea lions need stimulation, social groups, and medical care. Trainers pushed for enrichment, larger enclosures, and retirements. Some animals were transferred to marine parks after service. Others lived out their days at Navy facilities. Cases of illness or stress became flashpoints in press coverage. The Navy responded with tour, limited access for journalists, and research partnerships to show improved welfare standards. But skepticism remained. Internationally, the mirror was familiar. The Soviet Navy ran similar cetacean programs. Beluga whales, dolphins, and seals trained for underwater tasks in the Black Sea. After the USSR collapsed, reports surfaced of facilities changing hands, animals sold or moved, and occasional claims of revived units. The arms race logic extended underwater. If they're doing it, we can't stop. That reasoning kept budgets alive even as technology improved. Meanwhile, technology was catching up. Side-scan sonar got sharper. Synthetic aperture and interferometric systems mapped seabeds with high resolution. Autonomous underwater vehicles extended endurance and reduced human exposure. The Dolphin was still faster up close, still better at some last-meter judgments, but the trend line favored machines. Inside the program, that tension was obvious. Trainers taught new tasks, complex buoy placement, deep dives, while procurement officers funded unmanned systems that would someday replace them. The program's internal language shifted to emphasize non-lethal roles and scientific contributions. Papers on echolocation, cognition, and hydrodynamics came out of Navy-linked research, contributing to broader marine science. This had a public relations benefit and a real knowledge benefit. At the same time, the mission set narrowed: mines, objects, intruders. Anything that smelled like offense stayed off the table publicly and by most accounts in practice. There were still quiet denials. A memo would surface through FOIA outlining a capability test that sounded a lot like offensive planning. The Navy would say it never left the lab. A former handler would say they refused certain tasks. Between those lines sat the truth of most classified programs, boundaries negotiated in rooms without cameras, with people who had to balance orders, ethics, and the animal in front of them. This was the moment everything changed again, not because a dolphin failed, but because success hardened a belief across the services. Animals could deliver in narrow, well-defined tasks tied to their natural strengths. That belief, documented in performance reports and quiet commendations, became the justification for other proposals. While the Navy doubled down on mammals, an academic tried Pigeon, Project Pigeon/Orcan. To understand why the Navy's success emboldened others, go inland into a lab where a behaviorist believed you could shape a mind the way you shape clay. B.F. Skinner, already famous for his operant conditioning work, had a wartime idea that sounded absurd and in controlled tests looked brilliant: pigeons guiding a bomb. Start with the stakes. In 1943, precision bombing was more hope than reality. Cloud cover, flak, and shaky optics turned strategic into statistical. A single bomb reliably hitting a small, moving target like a ship was a fantasy. Electronics weren't ready. Radar guidance existed, but systems were bulky, easily jammed, or too crude for pinpoint strikes. Skinner offered a workaround: a simple glide bomb with a nose full of trained perception. Here's how it worked. In a plexiglass nose cone, a small screen displayed the target image via a lens. 3 pigeons sat in harnesses behind it. When they pecked the image, operant behavior shaped by thousands of training trials, the pecks moved aerodynamic vanes. If the target drifted left, the pigeons pecked left. The control system corrected right to recenter the image. Skinner's lab had already shown pigeons could peck at specific shapes and keep pecking despite noise, flashes, even jolt. Now he tied that persistence to steering. The action happened in long, repetitive training runs. Skinner and his team built mock-ups with projected ships, buildings, and contrasting backgrounds. The pigeons learned through rewards. Grain delivered the moment a peck hit the right spot. Over time, the birds became astonishingly consistent. In demonstrations, they kept the target centered despite perturbations. A jolt sent the image off-center. The birds pecked furiously until it returned. Navy evaluators, summoned discreetly, watched through a window as the screen lurched and then stilled. The birds didn't panic. They worked the problem. Skinner, who loved data more than drama, brought charts. Error rates dropped with training hours. Peck latency decreased. In one famous demo, a single pigeon outperformed a human trying to joystick a drifting image on a comparable apparatus because the bird didn't anticipate or overcorrect. It simply followed the operant rule it had learned. In another, the three-bird council outperformed any individual bird because the system averaged their pecks and damped out idiosyncrasy. This wasn't guesswork. It was engineering through behavior. But leadership balked. The ridicule factor was real. Bombs guided by birds sounded like a cartoon. Even as the National Defense Research Committee funded early phases under a code number, skeptical officers asked hard questions. What happens in heavy cloud? What if the target changes shape? How do we ensure the birds keep working under G-loads, smoke, or fire? Skinner answered with more training protocols, shock and noise conditioning, and better fixtures. He argued that pigeons weren't thinking. They were responding reliably, under conditions you could simulate. Competing technology nudged the decision. Radar guidance and proximity fuses were improving. The Navy had its own glide bomb projects using TV cameras and radio links, crude but getting better. In that arms race, a program that required live animals on the tip of a bomb, even if it worked, raised logistics and maintenance questions nobody wanted. You couldn't store pigeons in crates on a carrier for months and expect peak performance. You needed trainers, food, constant conditioning. The birds were not plug-and-play. Still, the performance was hard to ignore. When Project Pigeon was canceled late in the war, Skinner wasn't crushed so much as convinced he'd been early. He filed reports, packed the apparatus, and moved on. Years later, during the early Cold War, the idea resurfaced as ORCAN, short for Organic Control. The new pitch softened the bird imagery and emphasized the control concept. Biological sensors doing visual pattern recognition better than then-current electronics. The problem hadn't changed. Guiding a bomb precisely without bulky, fragile computation. ORCAN revisited the tri-bird configuration and tightened the engineering. Stronger harnesses, better damping, refined training images with higher contrast, and screen masking to reduce distractions. Again, tests showed surprising accuracy. Again, evaluators left intrigued. But time was running out on biology as guidance. TV guidance got smarter. Analog circuits improved. By the late 1950s, digital computation was on the horizon, and with it, the promise of guidance that didn't need food, rest, or veterinary care. Impact first, then legacy. Officially, ORCAN closed without ever seeing combat. No pigeon-guided bomb flew against an enemy, yet the program wasn't a joke inside the labs. It was a serious attempt to solve a real problem with the tools available before electronics caught up. It generated data that fed behavior science and human factors engineering, how organisms track moving stimuli, how to stabilize attention under stress, how to design displays that drive reliable responses. There's a human moment tucked in Skinner's notes. He wrote that the birds were industrious and indifferent to the gadgetry, a scientist's way of saying they worked without drama. He also acknowledged the discomfort. The animals would have died with the weapon. He justified it as wartime calculus, thousands dying in bombings versus a handful of birds saving lives through precision. That moral arithmetic ran through many projects of the era, but in ORCAN, it sat right at the tip of the weapon, visible through clear plastic. What nobody outside a small circle knew then was how the near success warped future thinking. ORCAN became a template for a certain kind of proposal. Find an animal's natural strength, build a device around it, argue that biology beats the machine at least for now. The pitch migrated: dolphins for mines, bats for incendiaries, cats for surveillance, each leaning on that early demonstration that trained behavior could drive a weapon as surely as any circuit. And yet the outcome taught the opposite lesson too. When electronics finally surpassed the birds, they did so decisively and cheaply at scale. Guidance didn't need food. Engineers could replicate a sensor in hours. Trainers needed weeks to shape a pigeon. Reliability and logistics beat cleverness. The program's failure wasn't technical embarrassment. It was the slow, quiet recognition that technology had lapped it. Skinner's pigeons almost worked. That almost mattered. It kept doors open for other animal projects that promised precision without silicon. If pigeons could steer a bomb on a test bench, someone asked, could bats deliver a fire to 1,000 roofs at once? The bat bomb plan. Stakes were brutal and specific, burned down cities without flying 1,000 planes. In 1942, Japanese urban centers were dense with wooden homes and paper walls. Incendiaries worked. The question was delivery. A dentist from Pennsylvania, Little S. Adams, thought he had the answer after driving past a bat cave in New Mexico. Bats nested by the millions, slipped into tiny crevices at dawn, and clung inside roofs during daylight. His idea turned that instinct into a weapon. Adams wrote straight to the White House. He knew Eleanor Roosevelt socially, and his letter landed on a desk that mattered. The pitch read like a parable of wartime improvisation. Strap miniature time-delay incendiaries to Mexican free-tailed bats, release them at pre-dawn over a city, let the animals roost inside attic spaces, and allow thousands of simultaneous microfires to begin when the sun rose. Unlike conventional bombing, which hit blocks and streets, this would seed fire from within. If even a fraction roosted, the city would become a constellation of ignition points beyond firefighting capacity. To understand why anyone took this seriously, you have to look at bat biology. Mexican free-tailed bats migrate in dense clouds, return to roosts reliably, and squeeze into cracks barely wider than a finger. They leave at dusk, feed, return at dawn, and seek cavities with shelter, exactly the kind of spaces that proliferated in wooden construction. If an incendiary could be small enough and delayed just right, the bat wouldn't trigger the device mid-flight. It would settle, nap, and then fire. The action moved fast. The National Defense Research Committee greenlit preliminary work. A team pulled bats from Carlsbad caverns and surrounding caves, learned to chill them into torpor for storage, and designed carriers that could release thousands gradually as they warmed. The ordnance piece fell to an inventor named Louis Fieser-Circle, already working on incendiaries. The device needed to weigh about as much as a few coins, burn hot, and ignite flammable material for minutes. Engineers tinkered with nitrocellulose and napalm gels inside tiny casings with an attached clip. Testing unfolded like a strange field trip. At Carlsbad Army Airfield, they built mock towns with Japanese-style construction, paper walls, wood frames, tile roofs with gaps bats loved. Early releases were promising. Chilled bats, warmed on schedule, flew to shelter and clung under eaves and rafters. When the charges activated, multiple test structures lit quickly. Observers wrote that the spread of fire exceeded expectations compared to a single large incendiary. The dispersion was the point. Then the infamous accident. During one series of tests in 1943 at the Auxiliary Air Base near Carlsbad, some armed bats escaped the test grid and roosted under a fuel tank and in other base structures. The time fuses did their job. Fires broke out where nobody intended. A hangar and parts of the fuel facility burned. The note in the report was dry. The method was effective. The subtext was chaos. If the weapon could torch a U.S. base accidentally under supervision, commanders imagined what wind and unpredictability would do over a city. Both as promise and as risk, champions kept pushing. Adams believed the accident proved the concept's power, not its failure. He brought in consultants, reminded officials that Japanese firefighting capacity was limited, and argued the humanitarian calculus. If this worked, it might force surrender without radiation or massive blast casualties. The Navy took over from the Army, rebranding the project under its code, and moved testing to the Marine Corps Air Station El Centro and the Naval Air Station at China Lake, places with space to stage larger drops. The delivery mechanism evolved into a bat bomb, a cluster canister shaped like a bomb casing, packed with radial trays holding bats in individual slots. Released from altitude, the casing would deploy small parachutes and open at a preset height. Trays sprang apart, exposing the bats to warming air. Each animal wore a tiny device glued to its chest with surgical cement, fitted with a spring clip to hold the charge and a 15 to 30-minute fuse. The engineering problem was clockwork reliability in miniature. The biological problem was everything else: temperature, shock, wind, and a living creature's unpredictability. Delays mounted. Each solution sprouted new complications. Glue caused skin irritation, a bat groomed the pack loose, fuses drifted with temperature changes. Chilling worked, but the rewarming curve varied by individual. Weather changed roosting patterns. Scale required staggering numbers, hundreds of thousands of bats to blanket a large city, and logistics strained credibility. Collecting, chilling, transporting, arming, and deploying living creatures at that volume looked less like a bomb and more like a flying wrench with explosives. Meanwhile, another project sprinted ahead in the desert under maximum secrecy. The Manhattan Project ate resources, attention, and urgency. Even the Navy's BAT program managers felt the pull. In inter-service meetings, the question shifted from could it work to could it work in time? By late 1944, the projected operational date had slipped again. Adams claimed the weapon could be ready by mid-1945. Others weren't convinced. Japan's defenses and the air war's tempo were changing weekly. Precision wasn't the only route. Overwhelming force was already burning cities. The internal assessments after El Centro and China Lake were sober. As a fire-starting concept, the BAT dispersal worked in test towns. The accident at Carlsbad accidentally served as a perverse proof of concept, but the logistical overhead and timing specificity were brutal. To hit a city at pre-dawn, in the right season for BAT behavior, with weather favorable for roosting, and with fuses tuned to local temperature, those variables stacked up. Planners compared that complexity to dropping conventional incendiary clusters, which were already devastating wooden neighborhoods. Cost wasn't the primary canceling factor, but it mattered. The BAT program had consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars, serious but not massive compared to major weapons. The real spend was time and attention in a war racing toward different answers. By early 1945, the Navy pulled the plug. The official reason combined logistics, competing priorities, and the emergence of more reliable tools. The BAT bomb never flew over Japan. Here's the impact with clarity. The program didn't change the war, but it marked a boundary line. Biological delivery of fire could be efficient in theory and impressive in controlled tests, yet it buckled under operational demand. The spectacle of a U.S. base catching fire during testing became a cautionary tale inside R&D circles. Demonstrations can mislead when the environment itself is the co-conspirator. There's a human coda. Adams, the dentist who set it all in motion, never stopped believing. In later interviews, he insisted the BAT bomb would have ended the war without Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That claim is unprovable and rests on assumptions about Japanese response and firefighting. Historians treat it as advocacy from a man who saw his idea sidelined by a larger shadow. What remains in the declassified files is the blend of ingenuity and hubris. Precise fuses taped to a wild animal's chest, a weapon designed to vanish into rafters and wake as flame. From mass swarms to a single feline enter Acoustic Kitty. The idea hits the brain, I have to hear this button. A house pet wired to eavesdrop, walking straight into the heart of spycraft.